the psalmist said in Psalm 104 verse 24, "O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions." The Carboniferous period began 300 million years ago and lasted about 40 million years. The name Carboniferous is derived from the word carbon, which is the main element in coal. This period is sometimes called the Age of Coal. Climatic changes occurred often during the millions of years of the Carboniferous period. Hot, dry spells alternated with cycles of rain. The seas advanced and retreated many times over most of North America, leaving vast areas of swamps and jungles. But by the end of the period, geologic changes had become drastic and huge forests died out almost completely. Widespread glaciation swept across the continent, sometimes reaching as far south as the equator. The formation of coal deposits began when huge forests decayed and were buried under deep layers of mud. Trees, stems, and leaves of incomprehensible quantity accumulated into extensive beds of peat, which over millions of years hardened and became coal. The Carboniferous period may be divided into two sections. The older is called the Mississippian, and the more recent is the Pennsylvanian. During the closing of the Mississippian, animal life made significant evolutionary changes. For the first time, some animals developed the ability to breathe and move out of water. Animal life was preparing to make the final conquest of land. The Carboniferous period is also called the Age of Amphibians because of the predominance of these animals and the important place they hold in the evolution of life. At the closing of this period, primitive reptiles developed from amphibian ancestors and primitive eurypterids became extinct. Many varieties of plants found the hot, swampy environments of this period ideal for their development. Lycopods were the most abundant plants living during the age of coal. The roots of these plants were shaped like the claws of a wolf, so the plants were given the Greek name Lycopod, which means wolf claw. The majority of the Lycopods were trees. Giant scale trees such as the Lepidodendron grew from 100 to 125 feet in height and had trunks which were 4 to 6 feet in diameter. The leaves formed a spiral pattern around the trunk, and fossilized remains of these trees clearly reveal this pattern. The name Lepidodendron also comes from Greek and means scale tree. The tree was given this name because the droppings of its leaves left scars on its trunk that looked like scales. Now, Siguleria is another example of a lycopod. Its sturdy trunk grew to about 6 feet in diameter. That is the size of this trunk from here to here, round. Was 6 feet in diameter at the base, but it only reached at a height of 40 feet. The long leaves looked like large blades of grass. The fact that these plants were produced by spores gives scientists reason to believe that these trees must have existed in a wet, swampy environment. Modern lycopods are generally called club mosses. They have no flowers and their evergreen leaves are scale-like. Now, calamites, calamites, sometimes called scoring rushes, grew to be about 40 feet in height. These were simple vascular plants with true roots, stems, and leaves. There are two kinds of these plants: the prehistoric calamites of the Pennsylvanian times and the modern hostils. The first ferns developed during the Carboniferous period. They were seed ferns, rather than the ferns we know as true ferns. True ferns bear spores for reproduction, but seed ferns developed seeds capable of being fertilized by wind-blown pollen. This is of evolutionary importance because these plants were not dependent on water for reproduction. Seed ferns had large seeds the size of modern nuts growing on their leaves. Some scientists think that these ferns may be the direct ancestors of flowering plants. Neuropteris, over here, the Neuropteris was a seed fern of this period. The Libacea, which appeared during the Pennsylvania period, was a conifer. Its seeds were neither quite enclosed in cones nor borne upon the leaves. Lebacia's trunk was straight and its leaves were needle-like. These are the leaves. They were like needles. They're not thick like normal leaves. It resembled the modern-day Norfolk Island pine. The first air-breathing land snails appeared during the late Carboniferous period. These are the only gastropods in the phylum Mollusca that were able to adapt to living on land. Today, many land snails have shells while others do not. Those without shells are commonly called slugs. So if you see a snail that has no shell, it is called a slug. The phylum Arthropoda was represented by thousands of insects which swarmed the Carboniferous forest. Some scientists refer to this period as the Age of Insects. At first, tiny wingless insects appeared. Examples of these primitive insects still exist today. Springtails, bristletails, and silverfish are all examples of tiny wingless insects which still exist today. Later, insects with flaps on their backs emerged and became the ancestors of winged insects. Stenodictia here, with both flaps and true wings. Look at the flaps and true wings on each of its segments. See, it has on this side, on the right side, and on the left side, is a good example of an insect in the intermediate stage of evolution. It is considered the first insect with true wings. Termites also arrived during this period. This is the termite that came up during this period, this Carboniferous period. And some of the flying insects reached gigantic proportions. Some of them were very big. Example of this is the Neuropsis here, who resembles our modern dragonfly. It reached 15 inches in length and 30 inches in wingspan. Much as these wings were a great help to insects in danger, they also got in the way. Why did they get in the way? It's because these wings could not fold in. So they were always like this. They couldn't rest their wings. They were always like this. So these wings got in the way. So through years of evolution, a new kind of wing developed, which could be used for flying and yet could be folded back for hiding. The cockroach, which I'm sure most of us know, is an illustration of an insect with this type of wings. Some cockroaches grew to be 4 inches in length. However, the giant-sized cockroach and the dragonfly eventually became extinct, although their smaller relatives survive to this day. Do you have cockroaches in your homes? Another kind of arthropod came to land during the Carboniferous period. Achitabus, a primitive spider, grew to be 3 inches in length. Primitive fish such as the ostracoderms and the placoderms were declining rapidly in the process of extinction. In the swamps of the Carboniferous period, a group of bony fish called ray-finned fish increased in number and evolved to the present-day varieties that dominate the seas and freshwater basins. The Amphicentrum is an example of an early ray-finned fish which was about 6 inches long. It looked somewhat like a modern sunfish and it lived in quiet waters. Ray-fins so named because their fins were supported by fragile ray-like bones. When we look at the bones, they were very fragile and they looked like rays. But these were mostly completely displaced with another group of fish known as the lobe-finned fish. However, it was the disappearing lobe-finned fish that eventually provided the means of evolving from fish to amphibian. The lobe-finned fish comprised 2 groups of air-breathing fish, the lungfish and the fringe-finned. Although both groups could gulp fresh air to survive stagnant, polluted water, it was the fins that determined the fate of these 2 groups when conditions worsened and water basins completely dried up. Fringe-finned fish use their strong, sturdy fins like stubby legs to push and drag themselves overland to other pools of water, while weak-finned fish like Diplocalis wriggled helplessly in the sun-baked mud and eventually perished. Over millions of years of evolution, the skeletal bones of the fringe-finned fish began to take the form of legs and feet. Although these 4-legged creatures could breathe on land, they still spent most of their time in the water. The water was not only a source of food for the amphibian, but also a necessary environment for their jelly-like eggs. These eggs had no shells and had to be laid in water so they would not dehydrate. Once hatched, it was easy for the new tadpoles to find food in the water and live like fish until their lungs and feet had developed. Even though the newly evolved amphibians were better equipped for survival than the fishes, life was harsh and often cruel. Their dependence on water put the amphibians at a definite disadvantage. Animals that can live both on land and in the water are called amphibians. The word amphibian comes from Greek and means two kinds of life, meaning life on water and life on land. Ichthyostega was one of the first amphibians to appear during the early Carboniferous period. This Ichthyostega could live on water and in land. It was a heavy four-legged creature about 3 to 4 feet long. It still had a tail fin, look at it there, that is the tail fin, for swimming and other characteristics of its ancestor, the fish. Its skin was covered with scales, and it spent most of its time in water searching for food. When Ichthyostega moved to land, it waddled slowly on its short, stubby legs. Another small amphibian of this period was the Diplomatibrand. The Diplomatibrand was only 6 inches long. Its wobbly, weak legs, you can see its legs very weak, very small, and fish-like skull, you can see the top of it, its head is shaped like a skull, suggests that it was still quite primitive. Eogyrhinus, right next to it, also known as Pteroplax, was a huge salamander of 15 feet in length that lived in the swampy waters, eating other fish and amphibians. So this Eogyrhinus was a predator. It fed on other fish. Its tiny, useless legs could hardly touch the ground, let alone support the weight of its heavy body. So it was just big for nothing. Without fins or strong legs for swimming, it wiggled through the water like a snake. The Diplocalis here was certainly the funniest looking amphibian of its time. Look at it. Looks so funny. I can't even tell if it's a rat or a fish. It had miniature legs and a skull shaped like an arrowhead. Wow. It breathed with gills and most probably lived at the bottom of lakes, scavenging whatever animals it could find to eat. Yet another creature of its time was the Mesosaurus. The Mesosaurus was not an amphibian, but a rare water-living reptile. So the Mesosaurus lived strictly in water. It didn't have two lives. It was not living on land and water, but just in the water. Its trim body and large hind feet, look at the hind feet at the back, were well adapted for swimming effortlessly through the water. It had a long snout and many sharp needle-like teeth, which means it probably survived on fish. The discovery of fossils of this creature, which is no longer in existence today, was found both in Africa and in South America, which represents an important clue in supporting the theory that these continents were once connected. So because they found fossils of the Mesosaurus both in Africa and in South America, it is possible to believe that these two continents were actually once connected. So we've gone through the Carboniferous period, the age of amphibians, the age of coal. We've seen how the trees were extinct and they were going below the water, below the land, and then they developed into coal. And then we had amphibians and reptiles that could live both on land and water. So in our next class, we'll be looking at the Permian period to show how the lives continue to evolve.